Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you've chosen to join us today for this webinar. My name is Carmen Imes, and I am Associate Professor of Old Testament at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. I'm honored to be hosting this important discussion of Black leadership lessons from across the disciplines as we celebrate Black History Month. Today, we have the opportunity to learn from an esteemed panel who will help us think through the roles of cultural background, gender, ecclesial commitments, and academic credentials, and how these empower and/or inhibit Black leaders today. This topic is near to my heart because I've been on my own journey of recognizing the limitations of my monocultural childhood in primarily white institutions. As my circle of influence has expanded to include many people of color, I've encountered warm friendships, rich insights, and vibrant energy for work that matters. The longer I've been in higher ed, the more it's become clear to me that Black leaders face unique challenges and opportunities as they engage with their institutions and with the wider public. So in a world where diverse leadership is increasingly possible, we all recognize that our glossy brochures with equal representation don't always translate into true equity and full collaboration. So I am eager to learn from our panelists today about what they've learned as they've stepped into positions of greater responsibility and leadership. Before I introduce our panel, I want to give a special thanks to our sponsors, Christianity Today and Seminary Now. Seminary Now is a streaming platform delivering video courses in Bible theology and ministry from a diverse group of leading professors and authors. I have contributed 2 courses, and the best part about being a Seminary Now teacher is that I get access to all the courses, and I've enjoyed so many of them. Here's a short video sample. If you're viewing this video right now at seminarynow.com, we encourage you to preview more than 50 courses available by a diverse group of instructors. I've had the delight of teaching 2 courses that are now available on the platform, but more importantly, I've benefited so much by taking courses by other Christian leaders like Esau McCulley, Dominic Gilliard, Ruth Haley Barton, and Sandra Richter. Okay, one last thing before I introduce our panel. Seminary Now is giving away a 1-year subscription to Seminary Now. So for a chance to win, simply share this live stream on Facebook, and Seminary Now will draw a winner from the list of those who shared. You can share up to 24 hours after the event to be counted for the drawing. All right, now I want to introduce our panelists for today. Beginning with Reverend Dr. Marshall Hatch Sr., who's been the senior pastor of the New Mount Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church of West Garfield in Chicago since 1993. He also serves as professor of ministry at Northern Seminary, which sponsors Seminary Now. Reverend Dr. Nicole Massey Martin is the Chief Impact Officer at Christianity Today, my favorite magazine. She is the founder of Soulfire International Ministries and the author of Made to Lead, Empowering Women for Ministry, and Leaning In, Letting Go, a Lenten devotional. Dr. Daniel Lee Hill is an assistant professor of Christian theology at George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University. He's the author of Gathered on the Road to Zion and is currently working on a manuscript that retrieves the insights of 19th century abolitionists in order to construct an evangelical account of public life. Sounds fascinating. Rachel Marie Kong is a writer and poet and the founder of the Fallow House, an online creative community. Rachel is the author of Let There Be Art, The Pleasure and Purpose of Unleashing the Creativity Within You, and The Matter of Little Losses, Finding Grace to Grieve, the Big and Small Things. And I've asked Rachel to start us off with a quote from a recent piece that she wrote.
Thank you, Carmen. In celebration of Black History Month and in the spirit of today's conversation, I'd like to share a quote from my article, Black Books Matter, featured by Christianity Today on July 24th, 2020. This quote I'm about to share speaks to the depth and the breadth of the words and the work of Black men and women, past and present. Buy the books, believer, and not just the ones about anti-racism, but the romantic ones too. Black men and women really do offer more than just a peering glass into the past. We are prized people of God, stamped with Imago Dei and standing with pen in hand to pour out plot and poetry and prayers with unbridled power, perspective, and personality. Slavery and suffering did not forge and force this out of us. It was there all the time, given and gifted by God with all his unconditional compassion and creativity.
Thank you, Rachel. That's beautiful. Before we get started, I want to invite you who are watching either now or at any time during this webinar to post your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Please leave a comment now to tell us where you're connecting from. I want to start out by taking more of a bird's eye view of what it's like to serve as a Black leader in your primary discipline. I'd love for each of you to share a bit of what you do in your experience as a Black leader. So Dr. Hatch, let's start with you. Give us some of a backstory and tell us about your work as a pastor in a historically Black church context.
Well, thank you, Carmen, and thank you for having us a part of this brilliant panel. I'm feeling like the grand old man here with all of these young minds. Listen, we've pastored here at New Mount Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church, and you always know when you hear Missionary Baptist, that means the Black ones. And it's, of course, a tradition that comes out of a combination of not only the National Baptist, but the Lot Carey Foreign Mission Convention, which, of course, always encompasses our projection into taking the gospel to the African diaspora. So I'm here at the New Mount Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church on the west side of Chicago. Been here as senior pastor since 1993, and this is my second pastorate. So this is altogether my 39th year as a local pastor. And I work here. We are in one of the most challenging neighborhoods in Chicago, and so we do a lot of outreach and a lot of lifting up a vision for this community and community development. So we're launching now a $50 million community development. We won the Chicago Prize, which means we're the most promising community development project in the city of Chicago. And so a lot of what we do is bring hope to a place that would normally have been forgotten. So this is our work here.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Hatch. Dr. Martin, what about you? Tell us a bit of your journey as a female Black leader in evangelical contexts.
Thank you so much, Carmen. It's an honor to be here with all of my colleagues and friends on this webinar. For me, my rooting in history is in the church. My dad was a pastor. I grew up in the church. And after college, I knew that I wanted to go into business because I enjoyed systems and processes, but I couldn't fight the sense that I felt a call to the church. So I kind of toggled between that. I started out as a consultant in Chicago, kind of understood my calling, and then I went back to seminary. After seminary, I served on a church staff, but I still couldn't fight this desire to focus on systems and processes. So it was in the church context that I became an executive pastor. And after that, started teaching and working as a consultant at that time. And then over time, I became a senior vice president of ministry at American Bible Society, and now a chief impact officer at Christianity Today. So the journey for me couples my love for the church, my calling to serve the church, along with my love and fascination for systems and processes and the way that we can lead organizations to really fulfill a sense of purpose and meaning.
That's great. Rachel, tell us about your history and experience as a poet and champion of the arts and humanities. And we're so glad you've already given us a sneak peek of your new book.
Yes, I absolutely love this question, and I always love to share how I started out as a young girl, young adult, writing poems, journals, songs. From there, I began to appreciate essays and anything that involved the literary world. I love to view this as writing was a way for me to make sense of the world, to make sense of the exterior world, the people and places surrounding me, as well as my own interior world, my feelings, my thoughts, my own beliefs.
Mm.
I took this passion, went on to study English and creative writing in my undergraduate years. And as of recently, I've had this passion for words and for writing, using writing as a tool for self-release, right? Well, in the most recent years, I've kind of shifted and have realized, it's one thing to use this tool for myself, but it's an entirely different thing to develop that in others and to call that out in
Mm.
others. And so I love that part of my journey has been, cradling this passion for myself, but then allowing it to shift and become a pursuit in which I'm, developing that same thing in other people to this day. You mentioned my new book, The Matter
Yeah.
of Little Losses, and just to share a little quote for my argument for the arts, I
Mm.
share in this book: words spun into sentences, spun into worlds, offer witness, the most palpable and practical way to see and be seen. This book reaches to unfold with an invitation to explore loss through the lens of literature, through stanzas and stories, through poems, and through the visual arts. Irrevocably, story is embedded with the virtues we pine to embody in reading or telling, hearing, witnessing story. We are afforded the safety and space to practice these virtues. Surely stories are a kind of simulation for life, a way to participate by way of projection, and therefore prepare us for life's curiosities, complexities, and conflicts, all of which are lived when you're a Black woman, let's be honest, and a mixed woman. So thank you.
Mm. Thank you, Rachel. Dr. Hill, like my good friend Dr. Esau McCulley, you are serving in an academic context. How did you get there, and what has your experience been like?
Yeah, that's a long story with a lot of footnotes, but the short of it is I graduated from undergrad and swore and made my roommate at the time join me in an oath to never go back to school. We were teaching in Houston, Texas on Sunnyside, Third Ward, low-income neighborhoods, and we just promised each other we'd never go back to school, and somehow forgot through the providence of God, and both ended up in grad school. Me, seminary, him getting a degree in education. And at the time, I was aiming for the mission field. I wanted to go to KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where I had some family friends who were training pastors there. But as I went through seminary, I just had questions that I needed answers to that I didn't have the time to get answers to during getting my master's program. And so that and a host of other factors led me to apply for a PhD program. But even when I was in a PhD program, I wasn't set on returning to the academy. I was working with the school that I helped start on Chicago's West Side. West Side is the best side, as Reverend Dr. Hatch knows. And in the Austin neighborhood, and I was like, this would be a life well lived, working with kids and training them to read and write. And you can see immediate payoff in some of the changes. But I get to talk about God, and that was always kind of pulling at my heart to be able to talk with people and talk to them about God. And so I returned back to Texas about 6 years ago now, I think. And I love it. I mean, my students they come from all over the place, different countries, different backgrounds, different walks of life. And they ask such great and rich questions. And it's just such an honor to journey with them in thinking about God.
I love that. Well, it can be a painful experience to be the first or the only one in your field. I'm not Black, but I am a woman in the field of biblical studies, so I have had a taste of that myself. Who do you look to help you build resilience or who's had the greatest impact on the work you're doing today and why? I'd love to hear first from Rachel, and then we'll hear from Nicole in answer to this question.
Yeah, sure. This is a really hard question because I feel like you could go on and on about this,
Mhm.
talking about who do you look to, who has shown you resilience and helped cultivate that within you. To keep things short, I will just highlight one woman who I have looked to resilience. And she is well known. Her name is Toni Morrison. However, I want to specifically say that I look to her, not just the writer, Toni Morrison, but not just the woman who wrote Beloved, The Bluest Eye, Sula, all these, stories and works that we have come to know and cherish, but Toni Morrison, the mother, and Toni Morrison, the editor. So here you have a Black woman who was working in a historically and predominantly white industry, publishing industry. And she showed up not only as a writer, but as an editor of others' words. And in fact, she was an editor before she became a published writer. And so I just really appreciate the way that she saw both her writing and her editorial work as activism. Her words were her art, but they were also her activism, a way of fighting for civil rights. I want my career to mirror hers. I want my work to mirror hers. I want I want the juggle and the balance of being a writer and a creative myself, being someone who develops the work and words of others, and being just a mother. She juggled these three things and held them so close and did all of them so well. You're going to hear so many quotes from me today because I believe they help to paint a full picture. But I love what she says about the work that she did. I thought it was important for people to be, this is from an article on Teen Vogue. I can provide the link if needed. But she says, I thought it was important for people to be on the streets, but it couldn't last, said Morrison. It would be my job to publish the voices, the books, the ideas of African Americans, and that would last. Books matter, books last, stories matter. They show us and tell us things that, maybe other mediums and methods never will. And so she is certainly one that I've looked to, not just the work that she created, but the work that she did, that not a lot of people highlight that so much. So
Thank you. That's great. Dr. Martin, how about you? Who do you look to help you build resilience?
Yeah. Well, the reason why I like this question is because it does underscore the fact that in order to serve in any capacity of leadership as a person of color, as a woman, as a younger person, you are going to need resilience. The definition of resilience being that kind of bounce back, that ability to hit the obstacles and not let them define you. For me, it doesn't, I don't have to look far because I've been very, very blessed with an amazing family. Internally, in terms of my family, I look to my great grandmother. Her name was Estelle Cartledge. She only had a third grade education, but she taught her children that education was the best way for them to thrive. She would say to them, they can take everything from you, but they can't take your papers. And what she meant was, when you get that degree, there's nothing that can stop you. So even though she didn't have the education, she raised her children to get an education. And my great aunt, her daughter, and my great uncle, her son, became our first PhDs in our family. And because of them, my mother has her PhD. My father had 2 master's degrees, and I was able to get my doctorate of ministry as well. So she's an inspiration to me, not because of all of her successes, but because she did this in the midst of segregation. She did this in the midst of being held back as a child of a sharecropper at that time. And she did it not for herself, but for the generations that came after her. So that gives me great, great inspiration, because I remember at the end of the day, this is not about me. What God does through me prayerfully will be for my daughters and for their children and for those who will come after them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Dr. Hatch, is there anything you want to add? Is there who inspires you or gives you resilience in ministry, which has to be an endeavor that's got lots of ups and lots of downs.
I'm awestruck with these two incredible responses. Number one,
Mm,
Nicole has really her narrative is African American history, and,
mm,
and all of us have come from the families with that kind of resilience, which is
mhm,
why we're here today. Just the fact that we're here
Yeah.
is miraculous, and of course, with the achievements that these families have produced with the folks that are on this panel, it's an incredible testimony. And
mm,
then Rachel had the nerve to mention Toni Morrison, whose picture is right over here on my side, a big autograph by Dr. Cornel West when we
wow.
had him on the weekend of the commemoration of 1619. We had him here in August of 2019, and he was tearful because she had just passed away, and the way
Mm,
that she transformed the way we speak about race. I mean, if you ever want to just kind of go to an Ivy League, just listen to the interviews of Toni Morrison, one of which she took umbrage when she was asked, why don't you write about white people when you don't write about somebody other than Black? As if being Black is not central to being human. And she
mm,
challenged that she wrote about the life that Black people have outside of the gaze of white people, outside of that sort of
mm,
double consciousness that we often have to exhibit, the code switching.
mm, mhm,
Those were incredible responses. I'm in the community that Dr. King organized in West Garfield Park. He lived in adjacent Lawndale. Dr. Hill, he knows all about the geography here. This West Garfield Park is where Dr. King organized when he became a national leader, and in 1966 led a movement here in Chicago for open housing, open opportunity against
mm,
slums, challenging ghettos, challenging segregation from opportunity. And
mm,
so for me personally, and there are many of my generation, it was Dr. King's example, his resilience. Growing up, being 10 years old as I was when Dr. King gave that mountaintop speech. And I thought by the next day when he was assassinated, we
mm,
had seen a prophet, a 20th century
mm,
prophet who stared death in the face
mm,
and followed Jesus to the cross. And
mm,
so that resilience has been something that has carried me in almost 40 years of pastoral ministry in this
mm,
community, sensing the presence of Dr. King. And of course, my father was a pastor, which meant I ran from ministry as fast as I could till they caught up with me. But he pastored one church in West Garfield Park for 41 years, in East Garfield Park. I'm on the other side of the park in a church for 39, going on 40 years. And so that resilience is something that I've drawn from
mm,
those examples, the latest of which is Toni Morrison, the person I
mm,
wished I would have met before she
mm,
went away.
mm.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, yes,
Right.
thank you.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody who's watching that we would love to ask your questions to the panel. We want this to be as valuable as we can to you and to your life experience, your own journeys. So please leave us some questions, and we will begin working through those as they come in. I want to ask another question and begin with Dr. Hill. How has your experience as a Black person informed the work you do? And what is one takeaway we can all learn from that experience? How does being Black matter to your work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question to ask me in particular. I don't know that I would say that my experience, I would be very reticent to universalize or ubiquitize my experience and say this is an
Mm,
experience that people as Black people or not as Black people. So I would probably want to reframe it as how has my experience shaped the work I do? And I
mhm,
think one of the more concrete ways is I'm always I always feel this tug in my heart, both a lot of biography at play here that we don't need to get into, but I'm fine to, honestly. there's always a tug in my heart of, okay, there are people on the west side of Chicago, people on the east side of Detroit, people on the southeast side of Houston, Texas, who are struggling to make ends meet and don't know where their next meal is going to come from, who will take their kids to the park and there will be hypodermic needles sitting around, and through it's, kids who are trying to play doctor are going to, and these are not hypothetical situations, these are things I've seen and I've heard about, will stab themselves with a hypodermic needle. And what does the church have to say to them? What does the church have for them? Not just like a message, but also a call to live and a call to die together. What goods do we have to share with them, to extend to them as a witness to the kingdom? And that, I think that's something that I'm always challenged by. I don't think all theology, all Christian doctrine needs to be operationalized in such a way, in such a pursuit. But I do think the church is put on the world because God loves the world, and is called to share the love of God with the world. And God sends his son into the world because he loves the world. And so how are we sharing the love of God in Christ with the world? Is just a pressure I'm constantly feeling. So like, to be even more concrete, the schools in East Waco are abominable. And they're generation after generation of families sending their kids to these schools. They're not being educated. They're being sold a false bill of goods. What does the church have? I mean, I can't change the school system necessarily, but there are goods I can extend to them. And what am I going to take them seriously as people whom God loves, whom God sent his son into the world for? And that is always just nagging at the back of my mind.
Yeah. Rachel, would you love to answer this question? How has your experience being Black informed your work, and what can we learn from your experience?
Yeah, I'm going to have to echo my friend Daniel here and say I really like the angle of, I want to be careful to not pin down my experience as the experience, but instead to, I guess, frame this question, be sure that this question, or my answer rather, is understood as I am constantly unpacking my story as a Black woman. I am constantly unpacking what my experience is. And in fact, I'm constantly unpacking the story of the reality that I am a mixed woman of African American, Native American, Irish, and Dutch descent. And so I'm constantly asking myself the question, what does this mean? Who am I? Where do I come from? Who are my people? What are the stories of my people? How do I honor these stories? How do I celebrate as my people celebrate? How do I grieve as my people celebrate, and for what they grieve and for what they celebrate? I'm constantly unpacking that. And so having kind of just given that as like, let's just establish this as a baseline. From there, I believe that posture informs the way that I do my work. I'm constantly wanting to learn from others. I'm constantly wanting to lean into what is your story? What is your experience? What matters about your story? What matters about your experience? And how to elevate that and how to highlight that. And so to take this from the clouds and make this a little bit more real, I'll give a story. When I published my first book, Let There Be Art, my thought process behind that was, okay, I'm gonna use poetry in this book throughout the chapters. Throughout every chapter, I'm gonna use poetry, and the way that I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna highlight voices, the people who are coming up beside me and behind me, and I'm especially going to look for voices that are underrepresented. I'm especially going to look for Black voices, Asian voices. And so that kind of posture, I think, is something that pervades the different projects that I take on, it definitely impacts the way that, when I am doing editorial work and working through submissions, you best believe I'm looking for voices that I can highlight that echo my experience or my story, and also tell stories that I don't know.
Mm.
I will also say I had kind of made a note, and I want to find it for myself because it was really good. Where did I? Oh, I'm constantly learning how to consider and count my narrative as necessary. I struggled for a
Mm.
very long time as a mixed woman, knowing or believing that my experience mattered in the greater context and dialogue that involves Black people and the
Mhm.
experience of my fellow Black men. And so constantly learning, how do we lean into, almost to what you were saying, Daniel, like how do I lean into the various nuances that there are that come along with the stories that we carry? It's different for all of
Mm.
us.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and so, yeah.
That's great. Thank you for that. I have a question that came in for Dr. Hatch. Somebody asks, Observant Lee is asking, I would be curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on the lack of Black missionaries in global missions. Can you comment on your experience with mission work as a pastor of a Black church? From your vantage point, what could you say to that? Oh, and you're
Africa.
muted. There we go.
Okay. I've been to the continent, Africa, personally, 21 times. And it's gone as technically, a missionary in the early 90s, Zimbabwe in particular. So, there's this definition of what's a missionary. I've in those travels seen white groups, particularly white youth groups, going and coming back from Ghana with their hair braided, and understanding that definition of mission had a lot to do with giving white young Christians a sense of being a part of the globe, and in many cases, white supremacist viewpoint of the globe.
Mm.
So, I'd make sure that we had some really working definitions of what missionary means. The tradition of the Black church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Dr. Hill mentioned South Africa, has been working in South Africa since the early 1800s. I mean, the part of the reference point of the Black church is from being in this that would emerge as the greatest empire on the planet, taking the gospel to the African diaspora. And so that is at the heart of the mission of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Black Baptist tradition in particular. The reason why we have the term missionary Baptist is because in 1895, the Constitution of the National Baptist Convention encompassed the Lot Carey Foreign Mission Convention, who was the first Black Baptist missionary to go to Liberia to deliver the gospel. So at our core, we're global, we're missionary minded, with the meager resources that we've been able to amass coming from the bottom of this empire. So to be Christian is to be global and universal. And to be an African American Christian is to be interested in the people who are at the bottom everywhere, all over the planet, which is why Dr. King is universally admired all over the world, which is why oppressed people all over the world sing, "We shall overcome," because of our example here in America has in fact been one that has touched the world and made, I think, incredible impact on global Christianity that continues to this day. I mean, we talk about the impact of Pentecostal church. When you get it to the history of Pentecostalism, charismatic expressions of Christianity, it really is almost African slave religion gone global out of that Azusa movement. and then beyond, which probably the most growing and dynamic expression of Christianity is that sort of Pentecostalism that is, in effect, W.B. Du Bois talked about the preacher, the music, and the frenzy being sort of the tripod of Black religious expression in America. The frenzy has gone global and renewed Christianity all over the planet. That's incredible spiritual mission work. I think once one of these young scholars do the job of doing all the research and putting it in a book.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much, Dr. Hatch. Your comments made me think of Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, just the solidarity that those who are marginalized can feel with Jesus, who was also marginalized, and that Christology, that way of approaching Christology just unlocks all kinds of riches for the global church. I want to take a question that came in from Rod and combine it with a question of my own. Rod is asking, what are your thoughts on the Black voice in the evangelical movement these days? And I want to just tag on that. It seems like after the death of George Floyd in 2020, there was a sort of, finally, the white evangelical church had a growing consciousness that there was a problem, that there were disparities, and that they had a lot to learn, that we had a lot to learn. And one of the responses that I saw over the summer of 2020, we're in the midst of the pandemic, is that a lot of white evangelicals started reading Black authors. And that was like one thing that we could do during lockdown from the comfort of our own homes, learning from Black voices. What has been, do you think, the legacy of that shift towards, was it a fad that went away, or do you see it having caught on more I don't have this crafted, but do you see a more lasting effect of white attention to Black voices? And so, as Rod has asked, what are you thinking about the Black voice in the evangelical movement as a whole? But I'm thinking in particular of the white evangelical church that kind of finally started reading more broadly. And whoever wants to talk about this can do so. Maybe Dr. Martin, we could start with you if you have a thought.
Sure. So, first of all, I'm on the executive council for the National Association of Evangelicals, and every single year we come to, is the phrase evangelical enough? In terms of theology and ideology, Black Americans type out as more evangelical than any other demographic in terms of Scripture. We have the high view of Scripture. We are the most Scripture-engaged demographic. We have a high Christology. We have a high dedication to the church and the institution of the church as a means of God's grace and transformation for our communities, for the world. And yet, politically, we are least likely to affiliate with the term evangelical. So what we saw in 2020 was, for a lot of Black Americans, a nice gesture, but we've seen a lot of nice gestures. The challenge will be, will our white colleagues, friends, counterparts, bosses, and others, will there be a sense of going beyond reading a book to placing a level of empowerment, to maybe even ultimately, dare I say, submitting to a person of color? This is where the challenge comes in. And as we approach this election season, what we're seeing is, while the gestures of 2020 were important, the divide is still very, very stark. All of the research right now points to the fact that white evangelicals, by and large, will still place their votes according to what they think are their values and not according to the integrity of a person's heart. So their values on abortion, on guns, on, free speech will lead them in a direction that will feel like yet another betrayal for Black evangelicals who have said, I'm here. Do you hear me? Do you see me? Do you care enough to say, I'm going to stand up for what's wrong? So I think we're in a very critical time. And I would still go back to Michael Emerson's book, Divided by Faith. I know it's a long time ago, it was 2010, but the number one premise they made was the only way that racial relationships will change, even in Christian spaces, is through relationship. So what is it going to look like in this season to build authentic relationships? Will they be willing to go and worship with Dr. Hatch? They should.
Mhm.
Will they be willing to go take a class with Dr. Hill? They should. Will they be willing not just to read Rachel's book, but to pay Rachel to get on their platforms and to have her speak
Mm.
and to have her instruct the people, not because she's Black, but because she's brilliant? That's going to be the turning point.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as an optimist, I still don't know. I don't know. I am a forever optimist, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just don't know.
Yeah. It feels to me like part of the challenge in these years since 2020 is that some of the good work that's now being done is met with great suspicion. Oh, this is just wokeness. This is just DEI is the new bad word, the new CRT that everybody's looking for. And I was really happy a couple of weeks ago in my Exodus class. I'm teaching a grad class on Exodus at Talbot. And I looked at the reading list for the day, and it was so culturally and racially diverse. And it was not because it was Black History Month. It was just because these are the voices on Exodus that I have come to treasure and that I wanted my students to read. And so I think one question that I have for white viewers of this webinar is, are you just checking off a box for Black History Month? Or is there something from today that's going to spill into the rest of your year that will change? Like, who are you reading? Who are you listening to? And I love, Dr. Martin, what you said about who are you platforming? Who are you paying to come speak at your events? I think that's a really good question. We have a follow-up question from Edward, and he didn't pose it as a follow-up question, but I think it's a great one to take next. He says, I'm a Black pastor of an all-white church. How do you handle the pressure to be the racial reconciliation leader if that is not what God has inspired you to do? Who wants to take this one? Yeah, Dr. Hill.
I think one of the challenges of the folly of race, is how I'll put it somewhat provocatively, is that we think that people are going to be governed by certain rules based on the color and complexion or background or genetic ancestral data that they have. And so I think part of the thing that you're wrestling with, or he's wrestling with, is people expect you to operate by a certain, I call them racial logics. Like, because you look this way, you function this way, or racial rule would be another way to put it. I think my challenge is just resist the logic, refuse the lie on the one hand.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, as a Christian, as much as it depends on you, make peace with all people. You are a reconciler, like every single one of them. The folly is that you are the racial reconciliation, the instrument of racial reconciliation, or that it's your responsibility and not everyone's. That's a lie. And so I would call it out as a lie and show them, and I would just read through Romans 12, practice hospitality. You know, all of Romans 12 is saying this is everyone's responsibility. All of Ephesians 4 is saying this is everyone's responsibility. But I would also resist the implication that I have to do certain kinds of things or be in the world a certain kind of way because of the color of my skin.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that. I felt that pressure as a woman in biblical studies, and at first so resisted, like women was not going to be my issue. Like, I don't want to talk about gender. I'm just here to study the Bible. And it's been for me a sort of slower awakening to the realization that that I could read the Bible with and for women. And that's been newer for me because none of my white male professors were asking me to read the Bible as a woman. And so it wasn't until I was asked to write for a women's study Bible that I went, well, what difference does that make that I'm a woman to read? And that's been very recently that I've even begun thinking more about reading as a woman. And the more I read authors of color, the more I'm realizing I need to consider, what does it mean to read as a white woman of Dutch descent? What does it mean that my ancestors came as immigrants to this country looking for a better life? And how has that shaped me in the way that I read? But I like what you said, Dr. Hill, about resisting the pigeonholing that can happen when somebody just expects you to be that voice. and not to offer anything else. I think Rachel set us up well for that by saying, let's not just look at Black voices as the ones who are going to talk to us about the history of slavery, but what are all the ways that Black voices are contributing to the wider conversation?
I do.
Does anyone wanna,
Yeah, I do want to just jump in with a very quick, very practical way of recognizing this question too, and kind of echo, Nicole, what you were saying. If you are a pastor of a church and maybe you are a Black pastor of a white church, or you are a white pastor and you are looking to have different conversations within your church, hire someone to come and be that racial reconciliation leader. Use your money, make a budget within your church to, if this is a need, if it's a priority, if it is something that you see happening or you sense needs to happen, put money towards this and hire the people who are doing this work. And this is what they want to do. These are the conversations that they want to facilitate. We could drop names all day. There are plenty of people that welcome the opportunity to go out and speak, to do trainings, that have resources, books, guides that outline how to do this work within the context of church, by the way.
That's great. Rachel, while we've got you, Ulysses asks, Ms. King refers to herself as a mixed woman. Is this on purpose to be specific of her background? Why not multiracial or interracial?
Yes, Miss Kong refers to herself as a mixed woman, and that is just because that is the phrase that I've landed on. I do feel that I do this everywhere that I go. I try to be sure to share that I am a mixed woman. I feel like to simply say that I'm a Black woman is an erasure of a different kind, to say that there isn't another part of my story, but there is. And so I don't say multiracial or interracial, not for any specific reason. Would piggyback on what you said, Daniel. I just don't need to be pigeonholed into using specific words. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. I think as our kind of wrapping up question, I'd love to ask, what's a key leadership lesson that you've learned in your vocational journey that you believe is crucial knowledge for anyone seeking to work in your field? And what are some of the best ways, this is a piggyback question, what are some of the best ways that those in white majority settings can encourage, support, and work alongside non-whites and other minorities? In other words, what do you wish your white colleagues like me would know and do? So you can shift this in either direction, a lesson for anyone who wants to work in your field, or what would you say to your white colleagues? And I would love to start on this one with Dr. Hatch.
Well, thank you. And, I would suggest always, to take the long view, which is really the godly view. If one looks at where Christianity is headed on the planet, you have to look at the 2/3 world, the Southern Hemisphere, the new evangelicals, and as Dr. Martin has, described how peoples of color really are across the planet, South America, Africa, Asia, the emerging of what the typical global Christian looks like will be a person of color. And so when we look at the church in the West, it has the money, but not necessarily the spiritual dynamic. And I think when we look back, your previous question about the George Floyd moment, it will be lined up with one of the great awakenings in the history of Christendom across the planet. We look at the first Great Awakening, the second Great Awakening. I would put, perhaps the Pentecostal movement as an awakening in the early part of the 20th century. But in this 21st century, we're living through that now, what the historians would look back and say is a great awakening, because the way that young people approach faith is going to be a way that is open to the way people of color are experiencing Christ in the 21st century. And so it's kind of like where everything is going. And you want to really just kind of see where the fresh winds of the Spirit are blowing in any kind of ministry, so that you'll be open to the ways that God wants to use you.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Hatch, can I piggyback on that answer with another question just came in that would be so great to hear your perspective on? How would you respond to the assertion that the church's responsibility is to preach the gospel and not necessarily to address race relations?
Yeah, we have to talk about what the church is. And often when we use that term, it's a white-centered term. We mean the white church, which means we're not yet embraced all of the expressions. You know, you just mentioned Howard Thurman's Resurgence, Jesus and the Disinherited, but a lot of his writings. And his whole project had to do with re-encountering Christ in the 1940s in an international context, rediscovering Jesus without the baggage of Europe, where Jesus never visited, by the way. You know, so it's really all about reconnecting with Jesus of Nazareth. And it's difficult to make the case that when you read the scriptures, when you encounter Jesus of Nazareth, when the Spirit of God is flowing, that God is only concerned about the question of eternal destiny and not concerned about the conditions that people live in. It was a white pastor that I heard say to another white pastor who said that the Lord told us to fish, and he didn't tell us to do anything else, just preach the gospel. And it was Dr. Lutzer who said, when the fish are coming down the stream and they're already dead, it only makes sense to go upstream and try to figure out what's going on. So, you know, that holistic gospel, to be very honest with you, is going to be the only gospel that's going to make sense to this new generation, because that's where the wind of the Spirit is blowing.
Thank you. Thank you. Briefly, I'd love to hear from Dr. Martin. Leadership lessons or advice for white colleagues, what would you say?
I mean, my one leadership lesson and advice is simply cling to the cross. And I know it sounds super simple, but the phrase, the song is real. We've come this far by faith. I am who I am and where I am because God was faithful to my ancestors. God was faithful to my mother. And by his grace, he's going to be faithful to me. So if I really trust his faithfulness, then in leadership, I will trust that my gifts make room for me in spite of the barriers against me as a woman, as a person of color. If I'm really clinging to the cross, then I won't have to fear, you know, the things that come against me and the issues that come against me, because I will genuinely believe that I'm more than a conqueror. So I mean, without preaching a whole sermon on this, this is our faith. This is who we are. Langston Hughes said, hold fast to dreams. I say, hold fast to your faith, because if your faith dies, you literally have nothing else. So this is the one thing I tell young people all the time. Stop looking for platform and pushing your way through. Cling to the cross, and I promise God will open those doors for you.
Amen. That's a beautiful, beautiful way to wrap up our conversation today. Thank you, Dr. Martin. Thank you to all of you. I want to give another shout out for Christianity Today and Seminary Now for making this panel possible. If you've enjoyed this conversation today, I would encourage you to check out Seminary Now's courses by Black leaders, including Derwin Gray on multi-ethnic church leadership, Brenda Salter McNeil on racial reconciliation, Esau McCulley on reading while Black, Barbara Peacock on soul care in African American practice, Black church studies with Marshall Hatch, plus courses by Antipas Harris, Dominique Gilliard, Alvin Sanders, Christina Edmondson, and Jonathan Brooks. As a reminder, we're giving away a 1-year subscription to Seminary Now. So for a chance to win, simply share this live stream on Facebook and we'll draw a winner. You can share up to 24 hours after the event and still be counted for the drawing. So please share this broadly. Thank you for taking time to join us today for this webinar. We hope you've been inspired and encouraged in your work. Blessings.